Hey, it's Lindsay and Brandy, and this is Real Therapy Gone Wrong, where we talk about therapy and mental health representation in movies and TV. While we are licensed therapists in real life, this show does not constitute therapy. Today, we are discussing part two of the Menendez Brothers. If you haven't listened to part one, please do that before you listen to this episode. And we will be using the documentary The Menendez Brothers and the docudrama Monsters, both of which are on Netflix. This will be our first two-part episode because there's so much to cover, and this part two, will be out on November 28th. So, Brandy, take it away.
Okay, first, I want to give a content warning. We are going to discuss child abuse, rape, and violence against children in this episode. Also, I want to give a disclaimer that we are not diagnosing any mental health disorders. We don't know the Menendez brothers. We are not diagnosing them with anything. Our purpose in discussing this case is to show the harm perpetrated by mental health professionals' lack of ethics, to discuss possible mental health outcomes of prolonged child sexual abuse, and also to highlight the lack of understanding of abuse outcomes in our legal system and society at large. Some of the sources that I used for this episode are the LA District Attorney's Office website, a literature review by National Institutes of Health, Town and Country Magazine, Vanity Fair, Forbes, NPR, ABC News, the Netflix documentary The Menendez Brothers, the Netflix show Monsters, and also People Magazine. So we left off the last episode after the mistrial from the first trial. And before we talk about the second trial, I just want to talk about a little timeline for what's going on in LA that is important to this story. So the Menendez killings happened in 1999. In 1991, a man named Rodney King was beaten by four police officers, and it was caught on video. I remember this too. This what happened the year I graduated from high school. And if I'm not mistaken, I think this is the first time that like police abuse against a Black person was recorded and
Mm-hmm.
came into the public awareness. So everyone saw these videos. You can probably Google it today and see these police officers beating Rodney King. In 1992, there was a trial of these four LA police officers, which I think probably wouldn't have happened if there wasn't video of what happened. And the police officers were acquitted. So, a little background about Rodney King. He was on parole for robbery. He had led the police on a high speed chase through Los Angeles and was later charged with driving under the influence. When they stopped him, he was ordered to get out of the car, and then they kicked him repeatedly and beat him with batons for 15 minutes. And the video shows that more than a dozen cops stood by watching and commenting on the beatings. He had skull fractures, broken bones and teeth, and permanent brain damage. So these four officers were charged, were found not guilty. And the acquittals were announced around 3 p.m. And less than 3 hours later, this huge unrest in LA began. Residents set fires, looted, destroyed liquor stores, grocery stores. Light-skinned motorists, white and Latino, were targeted, and some people were like pulled out of their cars and beaten. And there was almost no response from the LAPD. So this went on for 5 days. There was this unrest in LA. Mayor Tom Bradley called for a state of emergency. It was a huge stain on the face of LA
Yeah.
that these riots happened, that these police officers were acquitted, even though they beat this man for 15 minutes.
And that there was
Um,
proof of it. It's like such bullshit. What more could you need to prove it?
yes. And also, it goes to just that racist idea like the riots, whenever people of color riot, it seems like white people are like, why are they rioting? And they should be more peaceful. But peaceful doesn't work. And there's video of these men for 15 minutes beating this Black man and nobody doing anything.
And
So,
peaceful is also not a realistic response. Like, In
Right,
what world does this like big injustice happen and then someone's, well, let's just peacefully walk out? No, that's not,
right.
that makes no sense.
So there were 50 riot-related deaths, including 10 people who were shot and killed by LAPD officers and National Guardsmen. More than 2,000 people were injured. In 1993, two of the four officers were found guilty of violating King's civil rights, and they served 30 months in prison. And then two other officers were both fired by the LAPD and no longer live in California. In 1989, we have the Menendez killings. In 1991, 1992, Rodney King, and then the acquittal and the LA riots. Then in 1993 is when we have the first Menendez trial, and that goes to January 94.
Mhm.
Okay, then in June of 94, there were the murders of Nicole Brown Simpson and Ron Goldman, also in LA. And then that trial for OJ started in January of 95, which I did not remember the trial starting 6 months after the murders. That's bonkers. But January to October 95, we have the OJ trial, which is the most publicized trial in history. And that was a huge loss for the LA District Attorney Office.
Mhm.
So there are these acquittals for Rodney King. That was bad. There's this hung jury for the first Menendez trial. And then OJ gets acquitted, and all of that happens. And then 8 days after OJ gets acquitted is the beginning of the second Menendez Brothers trial.
And
So LA,
Leslie Abramson, she's on some interview saying this is terrible for our trial. Terrible
yes,
because they're looking, now there's like fuel to the fire to punish someone.
yes.
Yeah.
So LA has egg on its face big time. And same judge is over the second trial as over the first trial, and he did not allow any abuse testimony and any family testimony. So the second trial is completely different from the first trial. Lyle did not testify. And also the jury in the first trial could pick between first degree murder, second degree murder, manslaughter. In the second trial, they either said first degree murder or they were innocent. The Menendez brothers got convicted and they got life sentences.
Mhm.
Really soon after the conviction, they agreed to do a Barbara Walters interview. And Lyle says, like present day Lyle says, that they only did that interview in hopes that they would not be separated for their prison sentences. But it ended up they were for the first 20 years. And it's really clear, like every single thing I've seen, it's really clear how bonded these brothers are to each other. In Monsters, Ryan Murphy has a scene with them showering together, and there are several homoerotic scenes with Eric. And there's really no indication that they are incestuous with each other.
Mm-mm.
There's no indication that Eric is gay. He's been married to a woman. He's never said he was gay. People get to say who they are. So I think that's another place where Monsters really misses is I hate that they just he used that trope of, oh, if you're abused, you're gay, or
And it's like doubly gross because in the first trial, like I mentioned last episode, Lyle does disclose that he did molest Eric. But again, as another child that is a victim of abuse, it's like him playing out what was done to him. So
yes.
it seems like monsters almost use that to be like, see, they were sexual with one another, and then it like went into adulthood, and that's we've never heard that ever in
Yeah,
real life or the documentary or anything. And so it's really, I hated that was portrayed in Monsters.
me too. It's just really salacious and not founded. So the brothers are incarcerated, and many people in America are incarcerated over things that they did due to abuse. Either they were coerced to committing crimes by an abuser,
Mhm.
or like this, how a lot of women are sex trafficked. Their abuser forces them to have sex with other people for money, and or they're in prison because they killed their abuser. And Most of these people are women, but many are men, like in this case. There were two examples that I wanted to talk about just real briefly. So, this case is recent. Crystal Kaiser is her name. She's a 24-year-old Milwaukee woman, and she has been jailed for 11 years for killing a man that prosecutors said had sex trafficked her as a teenager. So, in what world would her killing this person who sex trafficked her as a teenager, what there is no justice for her to go to jail? That's the only way she could get out. And
Yeah.
then we're going to put her in jail is ludicrous.
And that's one thing I
Um,
want people to realize from this trial, but from many cases, you'll hear the kind of the cliche, like, oh, it's never okay to kill anyone. But when you're talking about being abused your entire life and then your whole life you've been in a survival mode and you're eventually going to break. No one can just sustain abuse forever and ever and do nothing about it. People do snap and that just makes sense. It just
sure.
makes sense. Like you reach a breaking point, and for some people, they genuinely feel that's their only way out. And and sometimes they're not wrong about that.
That's the
Like
thing.
they're not wrong about that. If this person is still alive, I'm gonna be stuck in this torture.
The other case speaks to this too. So this happened in 1996. Beatrice Taylor killed her ex. He had threatened to kill her that morning, as he had done many times before. And so she was arrested, and experts describe her case as a textbook example of a woman fighting back while in the throes of a violent relationship.
Mhm.
But then she was incarcerated for 23 years. And in 2020, Louisiana governor granted her a commutation on her sentence. So I do think the ship is slowly turning. It's just taking a long time.
Taking
And
a
we don't,
long time. Yeah.
yes, and we don't have a system that protects survivors of abuse. And then when they kill their abusers, trying to end the abuse, we put them in jail. And we don't, even in all of this, often talk about male survivors. And
And you know
there's just,
what's, and it's not that I'm supporting going to jail for 23 years for killing your abuser, but I've also heard in several cases someone feeling safer in prison than they
yeah,
did in their own home. They're like, yeah, I don't want to be here, but I can at least breathe here.
I think
Escape.
prison offers predictability, and a lot of times in
Yeah.
abusive relationships, you could do one thing and not get beaten, but then do that same thing another time and get beaten. And part of what is the dissonance is part of what is so damaging about abuse in a lot of cases. And prison offers stability. You know
Yeah.
exactly what you're doing all the time. So, like we talked about how we don't often talk about the damage of sexual abuse of children. And I wanted to talk a little bit about just battered person syndrome, or what we used to call battered women syndrome, before we acknowledge that men can be abused too.
Mhm.
And it's a subset of post traumatic stress disorder. And I'm not going to read all the criteria for PTSD from the DSM, but I just wanted to highlight, you're welcome. You can Google that though if you want to read all of it.
Yeah.
Um, but I just wanted to highlight a few things that are part of the criteria. So, one of them is exposure to actual or threatened death, serious injury, or sexual violence. So definitely they meet that criteria. Other criteria includes avoidance or efforts to avoid distressing memories or information about it, and also persistent or an exaggerated negative beliefs or expectations about oneself or the world, which could be like, I am in danger. That could be a negative belief. Persistent negative emotional state, which could include anger or rage or horror or guilt or shame. Another thing that I feel is really not talked about is the rage that people who are raped or sexually abused can experience. And it doesn't even take a lot of provocation. And it can be expressed in physical aggression towards other
Mhm.
people, and also reckless or self destructive behavior, like drinking and drug use, getting in fights.
Mhm.
Hypervigilance is another one. And I was thinking about this in terms of their belief that they would be killed. I could see if you were in a hypervigilant state, how you could experience some things as a threat that maybe to the outside viewer wouldn't feel threatening.
And if you've been
And
hypervigilant,
exaggerated.
if you've been hypervigilant for 10 years, that's a
Yeah,
long time to really be paranoid, looking over your shoulder and having to assess every little thing. But it's, you feel like you have to do that though, because it's not totally illogical. If you're living in this abusive
right,
environment, it's not really illogical. It's, I have to figure out a way to survive and protect myself, and that's what you have to do. And so you're right, from the outside, someone might think, oh, that thing seems so small. And I'm like, not to them.
right. Yeah. Also, another part of the criteria is that the duration of this upsetness has to be for more than a month. And in this case, they probably have complex PTSD, or abuse survivors in
Mhm.
general can have complex PTSD if the abuse is ongoing. And we haven't really talked a lot about there was abuse other than sexual abuse in this family. There was a lot of beating. A lot of other people testified to abuse that they saw that wasn't sexual, but was verbal or
One,
physical
yeah,
violence.
one story that stood out to me, which I would say this was abusive. I can't remember if it was with Lyle or Eric, but Jose had put them on the counter and was like, "Yeah, jump off the counter and I'll catch you." They were like really little. And then when they jumped off the counter, he backed away and let them fall to the ground and then was like, "See, you can't trust anyone. You got to learn you can't trust anyone." That is so fucked up to do to a kid. It's that one, that's not sexual in nature, but it's still abusive because they could get hurt jumping off the counter per your direction. But it's also really manipulative. It's like brainwashing.
Yeah,
Yeah.
really terrible. So we have a long way to go toward understanding how abuse survivors act, but there is hope because of attention to this case, the DA's statements about it, which I'll talk about in a minute. And
Mhm.
also the brothers are like TikTok famous now, and people are learning about this case who like you don't remember it because you were a
Mm-mm.
baby. And really younger generations have so much better understanding about abuse. Also, even Oprah did a show about male survivors of child sexual abuse before she went off the air. So it is becoming more and more understood that this can happen to men, that it is really damaging. So I'll talk a little bit about monsters, just like the cast, because we haven't really covered that. So the subtitle is called Monsters, the Lyle and Eric Menendez story, which I feel like he's calling them monsters, but whatever. I guess he wants us to decide who the monsters are. It was the most watched series on Netflix when it first came out. It was created by Ryan Murphy, who also created Dahmer, which I also tried to watch and could not because
Couldn't do
I
it.
did not like his portrayal. Yeah. The cast, though, in this show, it's 9 parts, is amazing. Javier Bardem plays Jose Menendez. He is so good. You really hate him.
He's good in
Um,
everything he does. Yeah.
oh, so good. Chloe Sevigny, I hope I'm not mispronouncing her name, plays Kitty. And then Cooper Koch plays Eric. Koch. Cooper Koch plays Eric. Nicholas Alexander Chavez plays Lyle. Ari Grainer plays Leslie Abramson. And then Nathan Lane is in it. And we're not going to really talk about the Dominic Dunn part of this story, but I love Nathan Lane. And I actually did enjoy his parts of Monster. So if you like Nathan Lane, you could watch Monster to get his parts of it because he's just lovely. So on September 19th, the day the show premiered, this is in 2024, Eric Menendez shared a statement to Twitter through his wife's account, slamming the show as a step backward because he says it doesn't accurately portray male sexual abuse and said it included, quote, vile and appalling character portrayals of Lyle and me. And there have been a lot of parts of the show that are controversial, like the incest implication. Murphy responded and said that he found Eric's commentary interesting because he knows that Eric hasn't watched the show and said he stands by how Monsters portrayed the story. Really isn't holding up because now, weirdly, in the past, like starting about a year ago, there have been like glimmers of paths to freedom. So I'm going to end by talking about those three paths to freedom.
Okay.
So this is from an ABC News article that actually just came out on Halloween a couple days ago, or I guess a month ago now that you're listening to this, October 31st, 2024. So the first path to freedom is a habeas corpus petition that was submitted due to new evidence. So there are two pieces of new evidence. One is a letter that Eric wrote to his cousin about 8 months before the murders, alleging the abuse. And the other one is allegations from Roy Rossello. And Roy Rossello was a member of Menudo, who Menudo was a very famous boy band for a long time. And remember, like in part one, we talked about how Jose Menendez signed Menudo to RCA Records. And
Yeah.
it was a very popular band. The concept was these young boys would be in this band, and when they aged out, they would be replaced. Ricky Martin is probably the most famous member of Menudo that people would know about. So in May of 2023, there was a Peacock documentary called Menendez and Menudo Boys Betrayed. And it features Roy Rossello, who was a Puerto Rican singer in Menudo, and he discusses being sexually assaulted by Jose Menendez. So he's another person who has come out and said, hey, this person did this to me too. And he has submitted testimony basically to his abuse. So there's going to be a hearing on November 25th, 2024, about this habeas corpus petition.
Hmm.
The second path to freedom is on October 25th, 2024, LA District Attorney George Gascon announced that he was recommending the brothers' sentence of life without parole be removed and that they should instead be sentenced to murder, which would be a sentence of 50 years to life. But California has a law that if you're under 26 at the time of the crimes, then you can be eligible for parole more quickly. The DA's office said that its resentencing recommendations are taking into account the defendant's ages, the psychological trauma or physical abuse that contributed to the crimes, and their rehabilitation in prison. So they have both gone on to get multiple degrees and do a lot of good work while they have been in prison. One thing that I thought was interesting is that Eric is actually this amazing painter. They show some of his work in the documentary, and it's
It is
lovely.
so good. It's like you could see that at a gallery. That's how good it is. Yeah,
Yeah,
it's amazing.
amazing. Gascon's recommendation goes in front of the LA Superior Court judge, and both brothers remain incarcerated, obviously, until they figure that out. The judge might consider the science of young boys and young men being sexually assaulted, how they respond, and how they react. That hearing is set for December. And if a judge agrees to resentencing, then the case would go to the parole board and then they would do their own investigation.
Mhm.
One thing that is interesting is even now, nearly 2 dozen Menendez family members support the brothers' release. Kitty's sister supports it.
Yeah.
There was only one family member that doesn't support it. The other path to freedom for them is clemency. So on October 28th, the Menendez brothers' defense requested clemency from the governor of California. And the district attorney said that he supports their bid for clemency and that would commute their sentence or grant a pardon altogether. So Gavin Newsom is the governor of California, and he is eligible to weigh in on the application on November 7th. If he approves clemency, then the case would probably still go to the parole board, and then
Okay.
they would decide what happens. And that is the very long history of the Menendez brothers and their murder case.
I'm rooting for them. I hope one of those paths to freedom works out for them. I think they
Me
deserve
too.
it. I think they've been through a lot and they've been in prison for a long time now. So, yeah, I'm anxious to see what happens from here.
Me too.
Yes. Okay, if you enjoyed this episode of Real Therapy Gone Wrong, please review, subscribe, and follow us where you listen to your podcasts. For our next episode, we will be covering the movie Bad Moms Christmas, which you can view on Netflix or Amazon. Speaking of moms, I have an announcement to make, and I realized I made this announcement on the last episode, but I'll say it again for our listeners. I am pregnant and due in December. And
Woo.
so very excited, but that does mean we'll be taking a hiatus from recording until April whenever I'm up and back in the swing of things. So in the meantime, we would love to know what shows you want us to cover. So please message us on Instagram and let us know. Also, rate, review, subscribe to the show wherever you listen to your podcast. It really does help us. And even just to give us some feedback. What do you think? Do you like our format? Do you have any feedback for us? We definitely take all that into consideration. So if you Real Therapy Gone, we are 2 licensed therapists. Contact us if you'd like to learn more about our work or want to hire us. You can find me, Lindsay, at relationshipmatterstx.com or Brandy at sellerscounseling.com. If you're making a movie or TV show and do not want to find us dissing your show on our podcast, we are available to consult on your projects. Get in touch.